Does anybody have any questions regarding projects? Since you're on, I know others are also getting online. It's good to see you. We are a week away from the Thanksgiving holiday, and I know we're all supposed to be sheltering in place and limited in folks, so it's kind of an interesting time for the holidays also. So I want to recognize that. And every year when this class was in session, Thanksgiving week was reserved for the field trip, which is now turned into your scavenger hunt. But after the holiday, Moultrie and I will go through your scavenger hunt game and take a look at that. So it's good to see everyone. We have 20 folks in the room. It's 6:42. I am going to get started. So this is wonderful. It's good to see you. I know everybody's contending with just the change in season and how our world is right now, but I just want to recognize and thank you for being here. This is our very last class, so we made it through 8 weeks. Actually 7 weeks. This is week 8. But it's been a pretty full, I think a really full-fledged syllabus. Thank you for sticking with us during this whole period in time. I hope that you've been able to garner a lot of wisdom and insight on transportation, and also spent some really good time just exploring the city on the scavenger hunt game, as well as doing the research that you need to for your class project. So we're in this week. Next week we're off, and the following 2 weeks after that will be your presentations. And I sent out the calendar already today, so you have any questions about that, if you need me to adjust anything, let me know. I've also sent the invitation out to all of our guest speakers who have come through the class over this term. And sometimes we do get a good showing of folks on a return. Sometimes they're very curious about projects. Moultrie and I will be putting together some sort of a evaluation matrix, but kind of a simple one also, so that the reviewers are also looking at what you've been working on and making sure that it also aligns with the course objectives and the themes of the class. So moving on to this tonight, if you have any questions, go ahead and put that in the chat. We can communicate via chat, and also all the other modes that we've used previously in the class. So this week we're going to close the class, and I'm really happy to bring back my colleagues and those who have spoken for the class, those who've attended the course as attendees. But we have a really great representation from a traffic engineering firm called DKS Associates, and they'll be here tonight to talk to you about mobility challenges of our communities. But prior to that, what I'll do is I'll let 3 of our guest speakers who will be part of the breakout session introduce themselves. So the agenda for the night, as I sent earlier today, I don't think we can put it up or not, but I can just share it. We'll have our guest speakers speak on what they do, their involvement in their work, how they interface as traffic engineers, traffic planners, and also working in this world in our community. And then we're gonna hear from, can you put up the agenda? I think that would be helpful, Moultrie. We'll also hear from Adrian Pearmine, who's our National Director of Smart Cities and Connected Vehicles from DKS. And after that, we are gonna put you essentially in the same breakout session as before last week. And what I emailed to you earlier today was a set of questions that I would like for you to think about and talk through with our guest speakers and those from DKS who are leading the class. And then in after the breakout session, we will report back to the class, and we'll spend a good 15-20 minutes in the report back in the kind of lessons learned. Go to a break, and then we'll do a Q&A with a group dialogue with facilitated questions. So again, if you have any questions, let me know. Feel free to put it in the chat. I will then let Robin, Kelly, and Rochelle, all from DKS, in that order, to introduce themselves, introduce the firm that they work for, and also what they do for a living, as well as how they interface in the traffic engineering and traffic planning world. So Robin, I'm going to let you have the mic, let you go do your introduction.
Thank you, Twee, and thank all of you guys for letting us come to the class and talk to you for a while. I'm going to do a brief bio on our company, what connects all four of us to each other. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, hand it off to Kelly, tell you a little bit about herself, and then Rochelle. And then we're going to send it over to Adrian, like Twee said, and he's going to talk about mostly what we came here to talk to you all about. So DKS is a little over 40 years old as a company. It's a transportation planning and engineering firm. Our corporate office is here in Portland. So that's our largest office, but we have 8 offices up and down the West Coast and another office in Austin, Texas. DKS is a little unique. It's a 100% employee-owned company. So we all have a really strong voice in guiding and making decisions about how the company operates. It's broken up into 3 sort of core services. We have planning, transportation planning, and those are your evidence database, big picture ideas. If a client has a problem or an issue they want to solve, our planners are going to come up with the idea of what your goal is, what your strategy is, do alternatives analysis, and try to come up with a goal, a solution. Another core practice is transportation engineering, and we are the infrastructure people. We're going to put in whatever that solution is, we're going to implement it. We'll put in traffic signal, we'll put in new signing and striping, lane geometry changes, whatever it is in order to implement this idea. Our third piece is transportation technology, and that's going to be system corridor-wide management. So how does what we implement actually function, and how does it function on a whole global scale or a city scale or a state scale or whatever your metric is? That's going to be where you also will tweak it. Find something that wasn't working with one piece of it and go through and look at it. Our company also has these other branches called practice groups that kind of bridge all 3 of our areas and focus on a practice. So transportation movement, mobility, smart mobility is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. We have transit, safety, things that focus on how to make transportation work as an idea, and how to use the nuts and bolts of electrical engineering to the edge of structural engineering to all of the things that is in the umbrella of civil, all within one firm of people who are really excited and really passionate about whatever it is that's their traffic bent. So that's DKS. That's what all of us go to and do every day. And the piece I wanted to sort of hone in the angle that I bring to DKS personally is I'm from here in Portland. I've been born and raised here, and I am 40 years old. And I say that because in that 40 years that I have lived here, this has been the most changing, rapidly modified city in that arc of time. And even the thing as fundamental as the hospital that I was born in is the Adidas campus for in North America. So something as small as just where I was born doesn't even exist anymore. I lived in North Portland for most of my growing up time. Right at about high school, like many people, I moved out of North Portland and over into what was then the boonies, way the heck out. No parent wanted to take me home after school for sports, training, or anything like that, because we were just so far away, way outside of Portland, or way outside of what everybody considered the Portland Central District. And that was 72nd and Foster. That was way out at that time. I went to Benson High School, and Benson still exists, but my major doesn't. That major was engineering drafting, and nobody would major in drafting now as a major. So that doesn't exist at the school. While I was at Benson, I interned for the Portland Department of Transportation because it was a department at the time. It didn't become a bureau until Sam Adams was the mayor, and he turned it into a bureau. And I don't know if you got to play around with policy at all in this class, but being a bureau is a little different than being a department in how you can function and what you can do as a city. So it was kind of a big deal. While I was interning at PBOT, I got to help review the first plans for the first streetcar. So the Portland streetcar opened just before I graduated from college, and I stayed interning there. And that was the first modern streetcar in all of North America. There wasn't one anywhere before that. So the idea of getting to play around with this new technology, at the time, there were no engineers that knew how to lay out anything for a rail line. So our design was made from engineers in New Zealand, and all of the plans had south arrows. So when we went out to the field to look at them, we had to turn all the plans upside down in order to check out where things were. And it was one of the biggest obstacles was this huge heritage tree that we didn't want to cut down. So we needed to reroute the alignment to go around this massive tree that we didn't want to cut down in the Pearl area. So it was fun to start learning how things work and how things function in a city, and how transportation can delve into the little nuances of everyday life and where you go and where you need to come from. So when I got out of college, I went to the firm that started doing all the transit. So all of the rail lines and all of the things that I cared about, that became my passion and what I wanted to work on. And really specifically the elements of multimodal and function, making sure that bikes and people and cars and trains and streetcar can move through wherever it needs to go. So coming up to now I get to play with yet another new technology. The project that I'm working on right now is the Division Transit Project to put in the BRT line up and down Division. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that project, but it's just another piece of going through and bringing technology and bringing transit and bringing improvements for everybody out to the community where I live now, which happens to be on the Division Transit line, still in the boonies by that 72nd definition, but out in Southeast Portland where I live now. And it's just a joy. It's what I've gotten to do. And it makes me happy to be coming up every morning and helping everybody with what they need to do and paying attention to what we can do and where we can go because of how far we've come and how quickly we got there. And that's enough for me. I'm going to send it to Kelly.
Thanks, Robin. I did not know all that about Portland, so that was really interesting for me to listen to also. Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly White with DKS. I'm a transportation planner, and I also work in kind of like the technology operations kind of discipline that Robin talked about. I grew up in Tacoma, Washington. I did not grow up in Portland, and I kind of got into engineering in a weird way. I have to say my favorite job growing up was a barista. It had nothing to do with math or anything like that. But I ended up interning at the Washington State Department of Transportation, and I got really interested in how much transportation, like engineers can impact the public, and how when you're involved in this field, you really know kind of like what's going on in your communities. So I joined DKS because I liked the consultant side of transportation engineering. You get to interface with lots of different projects and lots of different clients all over, mostly the West Coast for us. But that's kind of what I like about it. I will give context that I recently relocated to Spokane, Washington. And so it's been interesting for me to kind of be in this new environment. The culture is quite different from Portland, even though it's 6 hours away. So it's great to be kind of on the ground in Spokane. And I kind of think about the fact, like, so DKS is doing projects out in this area for, I don't know, 10, 20 years, but we haven't had someone in the field. So it's a really great opportunity for me to kind of get to know the culture and understand the communities and try to figure out what the real needs are that we're providing solutions for. So that's a little bit about me. I will pass it off to Rochelle.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm Rochelle Starrett. I have been with DKS for about 2 years now, but unlike Kelly and Robin, I am not originally from the West Coast. I was born and raised in Iowa and did all my schooling in Iowa, where I studied civil engineering. And so I decided to be a civil engineer initially because I was really interested in structures growing up. So I wanted to design bridges. And in school, I rapidly realized that it was a lot of number crunching and not very interesting, in my opinion. So within my field, I was working with some transportation engineering professors at Iowa State, and it really got me excited about seeing the impact of transportation on everyone's lives on a daily basis. And it really put a lot of things in perspective for me. I grew up in rural Iowa, so that was on the fringes of a town of 25,000 people. So we drove everywhere because that was the only way to get around. And that was, I guess, one of the things that really emphasized to me how important of a role transportation plays in our daily lives. And as a person who really doesn't like to drive, it was very hard for me. So that really led me to get into active transportation, which is how I ended up out here in a slightly more friendly space for that. And also, so I've been doing active transportation planning at DKS. And I really love just, seeing how it impacts communities, how it impacts our ability to get around as a city. And yeah, that's about enough for me. So I'll turn it over to Adrian. He can tell you about why we're here tonight.
Great timing. Thank you. Thank you, Robin, Kelly, and Rochelle. Adrian, I'm going to hand it over to you, and we can pull up your, or you can pull up your own power presentation when you're ready. So
Yep.
Thanks for being here.
Okay. Yeah, I've noticed now, of course, we've got to have some sort of technical difficulty, technology, right? When I run my PowerPoint blocking the cameras, I'm not going to be able to see you, but I want to make sure that you're the screen that I want you to be seeing. So I'll ask about that. I'm also getting, of course, notices that my internet connection is unstable. So hopefully it stays pretty stable for the next bit. I'm Adrian Pearmine, also with DKS. Thank you to my team for getting everything introduced, and thank you for Robin for introducing our company, so I don't have to do that. I'm going to start a timer to make sure I don't go too far over my time limit. I promised my team I'd not go more than 4 or 5 minutes over, because what we really want to do is get into the conversation with the team. I'm DKS's National Director for Smart Cities and Connected Vehicles. And so I'm leading up the area of our practice, as you'll discover here in 10, 15 minutes, that's focused on kind of the future of transportation and mobility and where we're going with autonomous, connected, shared, electric, scooters, and all of those fun things. And what we're going to talk about for most all of this class is this incoming new change in transportation technology and mobility, and what we really want that to look like in our city. So I'll quit with that part and hope that, I need to share screen first. You should be seeing the PowerPoint now. Is that working?
Not coming through yet.
Okay, I think I need to hit share twice. Screen sharing has failed to start. Please try again later. Oh. Okay.
Adrian, if it doesn't work out, we can also share it on our end too.
I have never seen this particular Zoom error, so I think I might need to get you to do that.
Okay.
It's working.
Is it working now?
It is.
Okay.
That's
So
great.
we'll be talking about, you see this, just the one slide that says Portland Traffic and Transportation, the new evolution, right? Okay.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
So to date myself a little bit, we'll start off with what used to be the future of transportation, this fun TV show called The Jetsons, where we were all going to be in flying cars. And I like to use this slide for a couple different reasons. And one of them is to show that even the vision of the future of flying cars from the Jetsons did not solve the congestion problem. And so we'll talk a little bit about the future of transportation. We've been talking about electric vehicles and been talking about self-driving for 60, 70 years now. So why do we think that this happens to be the era that we're in where everything's really about to change? And a big part of that is where the money is coming from to make these kinds of changes. We are seeing tremendous investment into new forms of mobility that have been coming up just in the last few years. We're seeing changes in the way we move people, the way we move goods, and many of us are starting to call this the third revolution, or the future of mobility. And so what do we mean by the third revolution? What kind of revolution is this? We'll start with the first phase, or the first revolution, or really just the first mobility for ever and ever and ever, was walking, horse and buggy. And then we went through this first revolution. And I'm not going to focus today on the airplane side of this, which obviously drastically changed the way that people could get from here to there across our country. But we'll be focusing in this discussion on cars and the revolution that came along with cars, and how quickly over the last 100 and 110, 120 years, we've gone from very few cars on the road to what is now billions of cars on the road. So is that solving congestion? We look back at 1916, we see that the average speed traveling across London was 17 miles an hour in a horse and buggy. Fast forward 100 years later, you're getting across town 6 miles an hour slower than you were in horse and buggy. So obviously the automobile, while it's been a great convenient way of getting around, has not exactly solved our congestion problems in our towns. Everyone can still hear me okay, right? I can't see anybody, so I'm going blind right now.
Yep, we can hear you. Sounds good.
Okay. So how quickly did this first revolution come about? In 1900, looking at this Easter Day parade in New York, there was one motor vehicle on the road, and everything else was horse and buggy and pedestrian. And just 13 years later, we went from one horse and buggy, or one automobile and all horse and buggy, to one horse and buggy and all automobiles. So that's just a little over a decade. And there was that rapid of a transformation. That's how quickly the automobile came around. We've been dealing with safety, mobility, and environmental issues ever since. And that's a big part of what all of us at DKS are addressing, is one, two, or all three of these things in the kind of planning and design work that we do. Over the last 20, 30 years, we've sort of been hovering around 30 to 40,000 deaths a year in our country alone with automobile, and a lot of those are pedestrian. We've gotten a lot of safety improvements in the automobile itself, where we're not killing each other in car-on-car crash at the rate that we always have, but have all kinds of other safety issues. There's other costs to this whole car revolution, and what a lot of people don't realize is that it costs anywhere from $8,000 to $9,000 to $10,000 a year to truly own a car. And that for a lot of folks, if you're living in any sort of financial margin, $10,000 a year or even $8,500 a year is really substantial. So are there other ways that we could be giving people mobility choices other than needing to own an automobile? The Interstate Defense and Highways Act, which is how we were able to pull together so much money and build something so rapidly. Again, we've been dealing with sort of the unintended consequences, and you probably talked about this a lot, Twee, I'm guessing, over the course of this class, is a lot of the negative implications that we've had on our cities with the roadway system and our freeway system, and the neighborhoods that got bulldozed over to build this, the neighborhoods that have been isolated and cut off from the rest of the city. We've been dealing with a lot of negative repercussions from those first two revolutions. And so that's kind of a theme that we're going to want to talk about, is as we enter this third revolution of mobility, how do we make sure that we learn some lessons from those first two, that we quit maybe designing our cities and our roadway networks around the technology, but start thinking about what we want our roads and our cities to look like and start designing the technology around us. So this third revolution of mobility, isn't that kind of revolution? It's what we call ACEs or CASE, or however you want to lay out this acronym, but it's automated, connected, electric, and shared. And really, it's the convergence of all four of these areas that are drastically going to change the way that people get from here to there in the coming decades. I'm going to focus just initially on shared mobility. It's the one we're all pretty much most familiar with. This and electric are things that we've already seen for some time. This takes the form of car share, although we've seen, this is a good example of when private sector comes to market with a solution, got a lot of people excited. It seemed like a really convenient way of not having to own a car, but having access to a car, but the business model hasn't been working out really well. But there's rideshare. We're all quite familiar with Uber and Lyft, or Uber and Lyft. Dun, dun, dun. Bike share, a successful program here in the city. Sometimes it's fully private sector, like the Lime Bike that we're seeing here. Sometimes it's a partnership like Bike Town that we've got in our fair city. The concept of tying all of these new shared modes together in mobility as a service is something that we're really excited about. The idea of being able to, on your phone or up on a screen, be able to look at all of the different options available to you to get from point A to point B and pick the trip that makes the most sense for you that day, maybe even getting to the point soon where we press a single button and it sets up a lift, but also a TriMet pass, and connects with scooters and other things. Mobility as a service is an exciting thing that we'll talk about some more, or transportation as a service. The reason I keep this slide in here is some folks are predicting that the number of miles traveled in transportation as a service, as opposed to the personally owned vehicle, is going to pick up so drastically over the coming decade. This is a pretty aggressive chart, but the point is that this is really going to change the way that people get from here to there. Other forms of shared mobility, we're seeing all kinds of smaller forms. We, as professionals, are pretty excited about some of these smaller forms of mobility, because some of you have seen a like this. How much space does each type of mode take to move 40 people? And bike and pedestrian is obviously a pretty nice footprint and a pretty environmentally friendly footprint, and as well as a bus, compared to the single occupant vehicle. So we're pretty excited about a lot of these new mode choices. And if they were being implemented across our city in a nice, orderly fashion, and we have great infrastructure set aside for them, we're pretty excited about the potential there. And if everyone was operating safely, wearing a helmet and being careful, that'd be great. But in a lot of the cases around the country, when we see some of these new modes come to town, it's not always nice and orderly. It's not always safe, and can become a real mess if it's not managed properly. So these are some examples of things that we want to be avoiding as we explore and implement new technologies in mobility. Electric vehicles, I'm not going to spend too much time on this other than to say something that we've been also talking about for decades and seeing some sort of false starts over the decades are really taking off. And it's not just Tesla, but it's every manufacturer over the next few years is coming out with an electric vehicle. So we're really excited about the environmental benefits of this. And this has been a rapidly growing part of our practice at DKS. Along with that new mode comes a lot of new infrastructure. And so this starts to bring in new players, has more issues around the use of our right-of-way and some other new challenges that we're addressing. Connected vehicles, I spend a lot of my time talking around this whole space, which is different than autonomous vehicles. Connected vehicles may or may not be autonomous at all. Connected vehicles are talking to one another. They are talking to infrastructure. And so in our space, we call it either V to V if it's vehicles talking to other vehicles, or V to I if they're talking to infrastructure. This can be with local radios that are built into the cars, local radios that are built in the infrastructure, or over the cellular network. And they are basically telling each other, you know, here I am, here's my heading, here's my speed, I'm slamming on my brakes, I've got a turn signal on. Or if it's the infrastructure side of this, it's telling the automobile, up ahead, the lane is closed for a mile for construction, or there's an icy patch 2 miles up ahead, or other information that car, in the current conditions, you can notify the driver, and increasingly as the car does become autonomous, you start to notify the car of what's happening. Oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way now. It's going to be a long time to implement this connected vehicle technology with cars that are talking to infrastructure. We're also going to have them talking to other signage and other ways of sort of letting the rest of the motorized public and people on bikes and whatever else know what's going on. There's going to be this hybrid world that we live in for some time. As I was starting to mention, connected vehicles may or may not be autonomous. You might have heard the analogy that a square is always a rectangle with the 90-degree angles and the parallel sides, but a rectangle is not always a square. Over time, we're hoping that all autonomous vehicles will be connected vehicles, but many connected vehicles for a long time may or may not have any level of autonomy built within. Automated vehicles. One reason I always start off in the automated discussion with this slide is most people and most of the media has been showing us this image of a four-door sedan, or maybe the old cute little Uber or Google type car. But really, as we start thinking about what autonomous vehicles are going to look like in the future, it's every one of these form factors, from a medium-sized shuttles that hold 12 to 14 people, to delivery vans to semis. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be these fleets that we expect to see have the most financial incentive to go as autonomous as possible. And so we expect it not just to be this kind of form factor that's so popular in the news, but everything that we see on the screen, including these small little delivery robots that are starting to pop up in different pilots around the country. As you go in the Society of Automotive Engineers, I could spend an hour just on autonomous vehicles alone, so I'm just kind of hitting some real highlights. But the Society of Automotive Engineers have identified these, what are 6 levels of automation, from level 0, which is cars with no automation, all the way up to level 5. And level 4 is pretty much full automation when we get into this point. The key threshold here when we go from blue to green is when, right now in level 0 to level 2, is when humans should be monitoring the environment and making most all of the decisions. and are just getting sort of augmented with information coming from the autonomous side. As we transition into levels 3 through level 5, we're going to get into where the car, the systems in the vehicle are actually monitoring the environment and making most of the decisions. And this is coming a lot faster than people realize. Not as fast, obviously, as all the hype that was in the news a couple of years ago, but coming along pretty quickly. The way these vehicles work is a combination of onboard computing and GPS telling that vehicle where it thinks it is in the network, what lane, what road, how far away from the white line do I think I am, and then a series of scanners of radar, LiDAR, camera, all kinds of different sensors and detectors that are giving this vehicle situational awareness. So over and above where I think I am on the roadway, confirming that you are where the car thinks it is on the roadway, and confirming what's going on in the environment around it. This is a fun video that Tesla put online a few years ago now. But you can run this video and see the operator never once touched the wheel, gas or pedal, drive down the road, see all kinds of obstacles, including a construction zone, but you get to see what the car sees as it's driving along that road and identifying bikes and pedestrians and oncoming cars. It's a pretty fascinating thing. The LiDAR in particular gives you this three-dimensional computer vision of what's going on. But what's interesting about this image is even within this, all of those sensors, knowing what's going on around that corner, knowing that there's a pedestrian in the walkway, the sensors aren't going to see all of that. And that's why that combination of connected and autonomous is so important to come together. And so, as I mentioned, it's really the convergence of all of these new things that are going to drastically change our mobility world. We're going to talk a little bit, actually, we're going to focus most of our conversation around what do we do as a city, what do we do as citizens to talk about this whole oncoming third revolution, and make sure as these new technologies get implemented that we're learning our lessons from those first two revolutions, and that we're no longer, hopefully, designing our cities around the technology, but designing the technology around the way we want our cities to look. And so our colleagues here at PBOT started a safe autonomous vehicle initiative to really envision what they want this technology to look like, which helped create the infrastructure, or the really sort of the technology or policy infrastructure, I guess is the right word, that they then used when the scooters came to town, and they were able to manage a pilot program. And so we can get into this a bit more in the Q&A section of that kind of pilot program. And so when is all this going to happen? We've been seeing the shared mobility stuff for the last 10 or 20 years in one form. We've been seeing electrification, as I mentioned, for decades. Connected vehicles are really starting to pop up now. And autonomous and some of the other new emerging technologies are really in the nascent stage right now. But all of these things are over the next 10 to 20 years, which for our transportation planning colleagues, that's not that far in the future for all of this to be happening to us. And so here's the point where I'll go ahead and do the transition over to the questions. And Twee, probably hand it back to you first to set this up. That was a lot of information in a very short time. I think I only went 5 minutes over, but that's normally about a 45 to 60 minute presentation that I just did in 20. So it's drinking from a fire.
Uh-oh. He completely, okay, I think we lost Adrian for a moment. I think we should get him back. Oh, there he is. That screen was really awesome. Actually, I was going to ask you to keep it up there, but what we're going to do next is break out into the breakout sessions, and all four of them, each four of them will be led by Adrian, Rochelle, Kelly, and Robin. And the questions that I sent earlier, which Phil had just put into the, thank you, put into the chat room, and Adrian brought up. These are the discussion questions that I want you to each discuss in your breakout session. What are the impacts of the new technology? And really, the class is centered around community challenges and the challenges of mobility. But as you tie the mobility and technology together, and also plan for our future, there also will be challenges in how the community grapples with all this, really. And the basis of how we plan now for PBOT, a big part of PBOT planning is for equity. So underlining all these three questions are the themes of the class. Really is it equitable? Are we considering for diversity, and is inclusive for everybody? So I think those are really things that we should tap into when you discuss these questions. So what we'll do, yes, thank you. So what we'll do is these questions will be brought back up again in the discussion, and we'll break into sessions now. And so you could individually go through and have a discussion about it. So we'll be here until 7:35. So you'll give you a good 12 to 15 minutes to talk about this, and we'll come back at 7:35 to report back to the class. So in a few minutes, Malsri will get you into your breakout sessions. Thank you so much. That was awesome. And thank you for narrowing it down. I know it's not an easy presentation to bring down to a 15 to 20 minute, because there's a lot of depth, a lot of information there. And it's a lot of good stuff too. And it's very applicable to where we are now. Yes, launch into the break room. There's been quite a bit of great conversations in the chat room. I'm going to have to go through it and read it again, but you're all going to be in the breakout session now.
Malsri, can you put me in one? I'd love to. Just
Sure, where do you want to go?
Anyone.
Okay, it's kind of a fun one, huh?
I'll send you to room 4 then.
Okay,
Okay.
Malsri, feel free to go into a breakout.
Malsri, you have the power to go into one and then go back out and go into another one.
Yeah.
As the host.
So did you invite me to 4?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to assign Michael to.
4.
Yeah.
I can go to 4, and then you could assign Michael, and you can go to one of the breakout rooms too. I think it's kind of fun.
Michael, did you? Okay.
I think we have full capacity back. How is everyone? How were the discussions in the break room? I'm gonna, yay, yay, that's awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna go through each group. There were 4 groups, and I will go through each group and just really ask some of the highlighted questions and what were the big themes that came out of your group? And I'll have perhaps one doesn't, well, I guess we didn't do this, but one person from that group speak up who's not the DKS leads.
Uh-oh.
I really do want to hear from the students. So I'll go with group 1. And
I can go. This is Emmy. I was in group 1. One of the unintended consequences about for-profit companies running new technology opportunities would be increasing the gap of accessibility of these alternate modes of transportation, especially if you don't limit or I guess enforce where these for-profit companies are operating. They can kind of just stick with areas that are profitable for them and leave behind other areas of the city that are not as profitable but might need those alternate modes of transportation.
anybody else from that group wants to chime in? Adrian, you're leading that group. Is there any main themes that came out of that group that you think the group should know of?
Yeah, I mean, the equity issue that Emmy just brought up was probably the main thing that we talked about, both in terms of concern about unintended consequences, and then later on during the monitoring part, like how do we make sure we put in the policies to encourage that, but then how do we actually measure whether that's happening or not and that they're being equitably delivered? We heard some conversation about scooters and safety and scooters riding on sidewalks, and that's an unintended consequence that we're already seeing, some concern there. We talked about how challenging it is to reach out to get all the voices heard. That it's a great aspirational goal, but everyone's so bombarded with information that it's really hard to connect with all the different communities and voices, and that surveys maybe have a tendency to reach those that are loudest and actively trying to go respond to surveys, and maybe not getting a lot of the voices that aren't heard. So we got to come up with some new solutions there. And then I think the other big theme was the transition period from like not having these technologies as we go through. And this is when I think about the connected and autonomous side in particular, this is one of my big fears, is that for decades to come, we're going to have blends of partially connected, partially autonomous, fully autonomous, and then a lot that have no connectivity or autonomy, all sharing the roadway. So how do we manage that transition?
I think that's great. Looks like you took like the first 2, and the group I was in really, when I also grapple with the matrix question. Let's go to group 2, which is led by Kelly. So in that group, there's Julie, Mariah, Megan, and Michael. Does anybody from that group want to chime in? Megan?
From our group, I think a lot of it was, well, I know Julie talked about how, where the people who are building these, coming up with these concepts and stuff, their biases and things like that, and how that filters down into the technology itself. Like especially since, big trucks and things are still a big issue. And if that still hits a pedestrian, whether it's automated or not, it's still going to cause some damage. And then Michael and Julie were saying about how congestion is still going to be a problem, especially if we have these vehicles that still drive themselves. They still allow people to get in their little bubble and things like that. And then Michael was saying that, but I know a lot of us were worried about the technology itself and whether or not it was still actually going to be safe or safer. But Michael made a point that it would still drastically reduce other factors such as, people arguing in a car, eating, being on their cell phone, or any other distracted driving that could potentially cause them to get in a wreck and not pay attention. Feel free to add anything that I missed, you guys.
Thank you, Megan. I thought that was
I
really
think
great.
also, Megan, was it your point about kind of how technology often can fail? And so concerns about what happens when it does.
Totally, thank you. I was more focused on you guys, but thank you for bringing my stuff up.
We also touched on equity issues with technology and just technology's ability to see people with certain skin colors, or that it might have certain biases in certain geographic areas. So that came up as, again, a problem of the technology following our culture, and that our culture might not be serving everyone, to put it very mildly.
Seems like there's a lot of work ahead. There's a lot of work ahead. Kelly, is there anything you want to add to that? I think those were really great synopses.
Those are good.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's go to group 3. And in that group, there's Nick, Phil, Paul, Steve, and it's led by Rochelle. So who wants to share from that group?
I can share a little bit.
Okay.
We were curious why like none of this third revolution, or why all this third revolution stuff is about like privatizing like what should be like public services and like things provided by the public, like the public good. Like why is third mobility things like micro mobility and not, putting in a system of light rail inside of every single for that's like accessible and cheap for everybody to use, instead of selling every street and public space to the lowest bidder who has the highest margin. It's just like that all the, and like on the tech side of things too, like we had some questions about the data security is obviously like a huge thing if you're gathering all this data as people are traveling through spaces, and unintended data security breaches of those kinds of things. Yeah, like you say, Dewey, a lot of work to go.
You guys went to like the technology piece and looked at kind of the cost benefit and technology, which I think is awesome. The economy piece is huge to this. Once you roll out something so dramatic and so different, even though you say you've been talking about it for the last 70 years, it's not that easy. Anybody else want to share from that group? Or feel free to share, or I'll let Rochelle also wrap it up from that group. I think somebody just didn't unmute.
I'll just add kind of along the same lines of the role of capitalism in all of this. Phil brought up a really great point in how, like, as we have implemented new technologies in various aspects of our lives, like television and the internet, it's been marketed as a thing for social good. And then it is kind of, as it's achieved widespread adoption, kind of more drops some of those pretenses, or you kind of start to see some of the other downsides that come along with it, which was something else that we talked about in relation to transportation technology.
I feel like there's still a huge disconnect then between community and technology, and how does it all come together and really work? Even though all of us are so connected on our phones, and everybody has one to some degree.
I think it was Phil raised the question in our group of why do we even need technology in our communities?
Phil, do you wanna bring that up? Do you wanna chat a little bit about that?
Oh, everyone has spoken about it pretty well, but like, I guess I'm just questioning that assumption in the second question around like, we got a lot of technology, and then to your point about, you know, does the phone bring us together, or does it drive us farther apart and disconnect us? Like that case is far from clear in my mind. So I mean, I appreciate that we're on this path, like the genie's not going back in the bottle, so we have to manage it. But man, it is a double-edged sword, and I wish we were putting our priorities and our money elsewhere. I guess the older I get, the more I feel that way.
Yeah. I have to thank the advances of technology to get us to where we are in this period of COVID, where we could still connect with each other. So, right, regardless of how you take technology to use it for the better or for the good, I think it's also really important to recognize where we are in this information age, like overloaded, really, really overloaded with information. And when Robin and I went to high school together, there was no internet. When I was in college, there was no internet. So there was no Googling or anything. We actually had to go to the library, and many of you, I'm sure too, had to go to the library and actually get into an encyclopedia and really do your research, do your due diligence. And I remember that stuff that I used to do when I combed through the encyclopedia. But I think it's very important to decipher the good of the technology versus the bad of the technology. And like, how do you mold it into a community, and how do you plan for a community? Kind of like the Division Transit Project. How do you make it so it works for you and not against you? It's like a $65 million question. So
it's a great point, Tweet. The technology is neutral, right? It's the people that how we use it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely for the people. And I have to share. It's like I was in a 60 people Zoom call this morning, and there's just there's like a need for a human connection. It's like step away from all the work that you're doing, and actually each person has like a good 5 to 10 minutes just to check in and say, why are we here? We've been in COVID since March, and we're in this 2D world, really face to face against a computer. And I think we're really just missing that human connection. So I'm getting that on phone calls, but it's not the same thing as social media. It brings us together, but it can also tear us apart. So I think we should have to be very, very careful as we measure and like frame out the metrics of how we advance technology and make it for people. So these are really good conversations, and we can totally keep going. But I want to go to the fourth group, which is the one I was able to sit in on for a second or two. We talked about scooters. So anybody from that group want to bring up the conversation about scooter and how it's actually working for us or not? So in that group was Josh, Carrie, Karen, Michael, Ray, and led by Robin.
Well, this is Karen. I'll just mention that we talked a lot about some of the things that were brought up in the other groups, but how scooters, maybe, you know, how do we protect ourselves when using them, and who is using them, and how do we measure who has access and who is not using this technology? But then how do we protect people who are not using them? So people who might be walking or cycling or anything else like that. And how do we balance that? But at least it kind of felt like the scooters were kind of thrown out there, and without that really good transition period, like so where do they go, and how do we manage that technology? I think they can be incredibly useful, but it also might make it a sidewalk or a bike lane more dangerous for people who are already using those modes of transportation.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share from that group? Or also, I'll let Robin wrap up that group, because I think we were like really deep in conversation about Matrix also. Maybe we should talk about that as a group. Robin, do you want to share some things you were leading? I think you're great.
We spent a lot of time just kind of focused on the idea of unintended consequences as a factor of trade-offs. It wasn't about necessarily good and this is bad, but the idea that things can both be good and bad at the same time. And I pointed out a little bit about spending money to get a bigger impact that doesn't actually do the whole job, and if that's okay or not, whether you're going to rebuild a whole corridor halfway or the blocks fully. Therefore, the blocks get a great infrastructure, but you go 2 more blocks and nobody has anything. Or halfway measure, that's a whole section of a roadway. And then nobody really gets everything that they need, but everybody collectively improves. So we spent some time talking about that as a concept, and was able to kind of engage. And then I guess there was a previous class that you guys had, and you were talking a little bit about the individual technology. And I heard twice from 2 different groups now, the light detection of skin, where you couldn't see a particular skin color with, I guess, a previous class. So I hope we get to talk about that a little bit in the Q&A, because I have questions and some perspective about that. But it was just a really collective conversation about trade-offs, and we didn't get too much beyond that, I think, in our discussion.
Yeah, no, this is great. I like the debrief, but we do have another about 20 minutes to spend some time to talk more. So let's go to a break, because I think it'd be good to get us up and about and stretch a little, grab some more tea, coffee, wine, whatever you drink, water. And we shall, let's do 10 minutes. I know we went a little bit over, so let's return back at 8:03 as a group. This is good. These are great conversations. How's everyone? Everyone's returning back. I think it was a really amazingly lovely and also lively discussion. I love it. I'm gonna hand the floor back to Adrian so he can help me tie this together.
Thanks, Twee. I heard some great comments in there. It's so neat to throw such a bunch of information at you and then hear you coming up addressing such critical issues. The idea of why do we need technology to solve this for us, but then recognizing that it's kind of happening and it's coming and it's pretty impossible to put that genie back in the bottle. I think both, like the first one's a great question and the second one's a great realization, and that's part of what we're dealing with, is that a lot of this technology advancement is happening. And so it's not a question of is it going to happen, but how do we want to guide it to happen in a way that creates the city that we want to live in, instead of just letting it happen and then reacting to the technology as it happens to us. I heard a great comment about sort of the trade-offs between, why are we investing and why is all this new technology coming when we've got great public transportation like light rail? Why aren't we investing in that? And I think that whole discussion about private versus public with these new modes and a lot of this stuff is kind of a common theme that I heard from a lot of these different comments. And so there's a couple different things. One is that for most of these new mobility choices, the scooters, the e-bikes, regular bike share, and even the car share, a lot of it is, if the right policy is put into place, it's not instead of public transportation, but it's intended, hopefully, to help us solve the first and last mile dilemma that we're always dealing with. Transit is great if you can get to transit, and if you can get from transit to where you have to go at the end of your trip. And then depending on what the type of trip is and what you're carrying and whether it's rainy, how far away you are from that transit stop can be the reason that you don't do it. And so if we can tie all these together so it becomes a mobility ecosystem of first and last mile choices, then hopefully it will be supplementing our public transportation and not instead of. And so as we're experimenting, and a lot of this really truly is experimenting, we're going to see some of these things fail. We've already seen some of them fail with car share under the current business models. The public sector is really kind of saying, let's let the private sector take all the risk and do this experimentation and see which of these things work. But at the end of the day, what we really need is some sort of mobility manager, some sheriff in charge of making sure that all of these different pieces are playing together. And that's the only way that we're really going to address these equity challenges that we're talking about and make sure that it doesn't only roll out in the neighborhoods that are most profitable, and make sure that they don't only serve the people that they want to serve. So that's a really big challenge. And maybe one of the last points, I only heard a little bit about data security, but I'm glad that you guys brought it up, because when we think about these new technologies, I mean, we had technical problems just in this webinar that we're doing, and we've been working on Zoom for 9 months now. How are we still having technical problems with something like this? And so, data security, data privacy, resiliency, redundancy of these networks, all of those things need to be addressed along with all these broader policy issues. So I think Twee said it best. We've got a lot of work to do.
Oh, I don't know if I said it best, but I just know that it's true. That I know is true. We do have this time together, and I really would love to see if there's a way. We hinted the conversation about Matrix, and is that something we want to talk about in the next 5 to 10 minutes? I think there's also some real need to talk about some of the policy and also the conversations regarding the engineering design of lighting. I'd love to have this opportunity and this floor to hand it back to you to have this dialogue, because it's and one thing having those who live in the city of Portland be a part of the class, but it's another thing having the professionals on the other end also like in the same space, in the same room, to recognize like these are really, really intentional problems. How can we work at solving these problems at a policy level, at a planning level, at a design level, and ultimately at a implementation level? And how do you make it more equitable? So those are really broad brush ideas, but if we can hone down to like what big topic would you want this to be a good takeaway from the session? Anyone? Bill.
You want a question from that's for us to answer?
Yeah, I really want to get your take on it.
Well, I would really like to hear, while we have these like experienced smart folks in our session, like what their perspective on consultants can do to help nudge those things with their clients, bring equity considerations into the conversation, even if they don't want to get brought into the conversation. And like, you know, what can everyone else do that is helpful of those kinds of efforts? And I guess, you know, specifically equity focused things, since that's the course kind of driving direction.
Robin, you want to take it away?
You know that I did. I'm going to speak a little bit about the realm I don't work in, and that is planning. So we have two girls here that are two women, my apologies, here that are in planning. And one of the things that I brought up in our session, that the breakout session I was in, is that the way that technology drives how we do things doesn't come in a vacuum, and technology itself doesn't get implemented into a vacuum. It always starts as a project. You start with a project plan, and somebody made a plan to do it. And the way that legally in this entire United States of America requires planning projects to have to engage community in the planning stage. You have to engage who is affected by what you're doing, and you have to do a no-build analysis. We have to do all of this work ahead of time to decide what will the impact be, and will that be good? Are we actually solving the problem before you actually start getting it to me, which is the engineering part, to actually implement the problem solution? But typically in the past, because it's a requirement for every project, your agency will have a come to me community approach. They will have a city in their city hall, in their area, in their space. They'll have it set up to make some sort of a public notice and hope people show up and tell them whatever they think. Then once some period of time has passed, then they close it for comments and continue on with the project. So we build things in a vacuum, in a silo. What is happening now, which I think is really exciting, but it's coming out actually from the transit world more predominantly, is agencies are recognizing the need to go to people instead of waiting for people to come to them. Because like I said, it's a requirement for community engagement. That's not a choice. It's not just because they feel good and want to do it. You cannot get funding without proving that you talk to people. And that change in methodology probably over the last couple of years started with the Vine out here in the Northwest. So the Vine in Vancouver, that BRT line. The transit agency intentionally went to the community and started asking them, and in however many languages they needed, in however many locations they needed, in however many spaces to really get that community's input. And what happened on the Vine is the project that the engineering community started with, the planners started with, they ended up tossing the entire project. Like literally, the entire project at its conception was tossed after feedback from the community. They completely changed the approach, where the stations were, how they were laid out, the type of amenities that were needed, in which places. All of that got just redone after this community engagement, because they were asking questions they never thought to ask to people they never heard from. Here in Portland, I love the engagement level of the bike community, but the bike community is so loud and so active that no other non-motorized mode ever gets the level of engagement. And that's what we in the city are learning to change, because for a long time we've been excited about that. This is Bike City USA, and we love that about this city. But the Division Transit Project in particular is looking at how do we reach people who aren't riding bikes and aren't our huge spokesperson, but at the same time engage bikes and create the opportunity for that to flow out to Gresham, because the Division Transit line is from downtown Portland all the way to downtown Gresham. And that methodology of intentionally going to your community and intentionally seeking it, that took years of engagement, years of meetings. It also made it the individual people who were choosing to be invested in the conversation had to make a commitment for years to stay engaged and become a representative of their community. And then at the end, there were a lot of decisions that were made that didn't benefit all of the needs of those different people, because this was a transit project. It wasn't a stormwater project. It wasn't a street lighting project. It wasn't a, you name it, other needs that this community also needed. It wasn't a project to do that. The funding was not for that. And so there was a lot of education to the community that had never engaged before about how does the funding work? How do these projects function? Things that those loud voices already knew. They already knew how to speak. They already knew the talk. They already knew the code. So this way that we engage equity, it's twofold. It's one, it's getting people to get engaged from the policy makers to the people, knowing that you're going to need to go to community fairs. You're going to need to go in 7 languages that you would not normally use. When you have translation materials or we create these flyers to talk about a project, they need to be as simple as possible to communicate a message clearly to the layman, not somebody who's already engaged. But at the same time, citizens have to know and pay attention that when somebody tells you something's coming in your street, it's not tomorrow. It's 5 years from now. Care about it today. Talk about it today while it's still dots and ideas on paper before shovels are in the ground and you didn't know it was coming and you're saying, hey, I don't like this. I don't like what you're doing. But by that time, it's a lot harder to change and shift. So education on both sides and how to engage. And that's what we are trying to do, DCAS in particular, with that whole 3-way break that we get into the weeds of the details. We try and get big picture. And then we also try and help whole corridors function and still think about keeping things connected and making them work. And yeah, it's hard, but the biggest thing is recognizing to be engaged and also that you need to be engaged. So.
Yeah, I could add on too. That was great, Robin. I think as a consultant, we're kind of working like 2 angles when it comes to like our clients, if you call them. So that could be City of Portland. You know, they hire us to meet their needs, but they also hire us for our expertise. And so it's our job to know the communities and to be able to provide recommendations and advice, and make sure that they are considering equity if it's maybe not in their original scope. And I'm not saying that like every single project that DKS has done a great job of that. I think that every company is taking a look at themselves, especially in this moment with the pandemic and with racial justice coming to the forefront of all of our conversations. Like, what have we been doing as a firm that impacts the public, and how can we be doing better? And I think it starts with what Robin's talking about, like getting into the communities before these projects come, building that trust with them and asking them, like, what do you need from us? And helping be, you know, we're storytellers. We understand the data. We know how it can be used. So how can we basically become advocates for the communities while also kind of letting them know what, you know, kind of being a translator in like engineering terms to like layman's terms too, right? Like translator in terms of language and also in terms of like technical knowledge. So that's just my 2 cents to add.
I want to share that there's also a huge opportunity for folks who are not in the industry to be, in this class itself, to still speak. But there's commissions within the city of Portland and other cities, which you can also be a really powerful voice to and influence projects and designs. And I want to share that the city of Portland has done its due diligence in making equity a very, very important proponent in their work. So I want to applaud the city of Portland. I know I've worked in other cities as well currently now. And equity is just barely it's just a word. So, I know Michael's here is the only one representing Peabody, but I want to recognize that it is an important aspect of how we design and who we design for. And that's essentially why I went off on my own and started my own business, really, is to be intentional with who you work with and who you work for. And then in that case, and I end up running into Robin at community events for projects, which is great because that she's really intentional because she grew up in the community and want to be a part of that project. But I also want to bring back, I think there was a really great question and topic on economic development and the cost and benefit analysis, cost benefit ratio to technology and community. And that, I think, might be the driving factor into how these technology get implemented into these communities. I know we had Forth came in, rep from Forth, and he talked about some of the shared mobility. Adrian, we did have representation from electric vehicle from Forth, but really they were talking about clean and just transportation system and the network that they're building in the a more just for the highway trust fund and how you spend the money. Which I think that comes down to policy, right? So there's policy and then there's planning where Kelly and Rochelle work in. And there's ultimately there's a engineering piece that needs to get designed and then construction. But there's some great work going on, but I feel like, yes, there's a lot of work ahead. But I want to touch on, if you can, Adrian, maybe you know more about this, or Paul, I know you brought it up in your group, is the cost benefit analysis, because I'm always very curious, because at the end of the day, it does come down to money.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I don't think there's a lot of that going on when it comes to these new modes and these new mobility things. I think the private sector or public sector, for right or wrong, is like I said earlier, kind of saying we don't know between scooter and bike share and car share and ride share and the electric pogo stick that's coming up next year, or whatever the next thing is, what is going to work and what isn't going to work. So we're just going to kind of let the private sector do these pilots and demonstrations and kind of let the dust settle to a little bit. I'm not seeing very much of, like, when we do cost benefit, it's public sector versus public sector versus public sector. It's, do we build BRT, LRT, streetcar, add a lane of traffic, those kinds of trade-off cost benefit analysis, but I'm not really seeing that happening in the same space.
Maybe it should happen in this space also.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's the right thing. I'm just saying I'm looking around at the industry happening, and I'm not seeing that kind of rigor being applied to the consideration of these different modes.
I feel like there's on top of that something that came up. I can't remember which week it was, or maybe it was in a totally different context, but is about what is incorporated into the cost benefit. So are we just looking at the dollars and cents? Are we looking at the bigger environmental impacts? Are we looking at the bigger social impacts? And maybe this is Karen or Emmy's class project, which is about what's included I can't remember, but what data sets are we looking at? And I mean, I think a lot of us talk about like how much it really costs to drive a car on a road, and that is really subsidized. So what are we subsidizing and what are we paying for?
Yeah, that was Emmy's project. I don't know how she's working on that. I think is a cool one. Adrian, it's the folks at DKS, it's how do you make data? Do you want to talk about your project? I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I guess what I've noticed is that one, a lot of agencies collect data from users of transit kind of on a one-off basis. So when there's a project, they'll go and gather that data, like exactly what they need, and then that's kind of it. And then two, I noticed the nonprofits that came in during our session, I think they just don't, maybe this is an assumption I'm making, but I feel like they don't have the capacity to do that large scale data gathering that PBOT or other agencies do. So I feel like that's just it's kind of a weird balance of like who gets access to what data and who gets to use it to make planning decisions. So my project's around being able to have this central repository where everyone across all agencies and nonprofits and even the general public can have access to real-time data, and then also have it be gathered on an ongoing basis so you can track changes in how people are moving across the city as we move forward with COVID, and like hopefully as we get a vaccine, and kind of see how changes are being made and how planning decisions can be made based on how people are moving around.
There's a very interesting project that I'm working on with PBOT right now, and I won't be able to get into too much of the details on the finding side because we don't have them yet, and even the ones that are sort of underway or have not been reviewed or approved or anything. But it comes really down to Emmy's point here. PBOT was asked a pretty interesting question a couple of years ago by City Council, and they said, we've been reading all these reports that the Uber and Lyft are having these negative impacts on congestion in downtown across the country, in San Francisco and New York City. We're reading these reports of how they're not solving the congestion problem, they're adding to the congestion problem. So PBOT, what are the TNCs, that's what we call Uber and Lyft, the transportation network companies, what are they doing to congestion in downtown? And PBOT actually said, well, they didn't say this to City Council, because they said, we're going to go and study that. But they said, we don't know the answer to that because we're not currently measuring congestion in downtown Portland right now. And we haven't really even defined, as an industry, we have our highway capacity manual and the other tools that define congestion, but it's really based on like freeways. Freeway was designed to go 65 miles an hour. People are only driving at 40 miles an hour. Obviously, it's congested. But that same logic doesn't apply when you're thinking in downtown corridors. And what is the objective in downtown Portland? Is it to move cars efficiently, or is it to move people? And we have the same goals on a major arterial that we have on our side streets. And they really had to sort of take a step back and think about, how do we define congestion? And then how do we go get the data to monitor that? And coming up with exactly what you're talking about. How do we collect this data, store this data, and then make it available to everybody that's doing these kinds of studies? And it's not, it's a big, tricky problem. And is the data just about moving cars, or do we need to be thinking much more broadly about what our objectives are as a city, and then quantify the indicators to those goals and objectives, and then go find the data to meet those? It's this is where we're heading, but it's a pretty tricky one. I wanted to come back to one point about some of the public outreach and communications that I think we're going to need to be really thinking about as an industry. And we have off and on, we've done sometimes better and sometimes worse jobs of getting public information, public engagement, and input into a design project. And then we go and we design the corridor, and then we build it. And maybe we do some sort of after study or after research, but rarely do we kind of come back and re-engage the community. when I think about these new modes and these new forms of transportation, it's not going to be enough to go out into communities and ask them what they think and ask them their input and then go and then just deploy things and walk away. We're really going to have to start thinking about ongoing dialogue with our communities that get their input up front, communicate with them during pilots and during demonstrations and through implementation and on an ongoing basis, because it's going to be changing all the time. It's not like building light rail corridor and then we're done and then we move on to the next project. So I think we're going to have to rethink public engagement, not just in better jobs of reaching out to broader communities, but even in changing the methodology. Unfortunately, that all costs money too. So we got to find cost-effective ways of doing this.
Yep. Everything costs money. There's been some really great conversations in the chat room and some really great sharing of links. So if you want to collect some of those, it's easy to do a copy and paste and collect some of the chat and links and just save it for when you want to look at it some more. And Kelly's also provided her email address if you want to contact. I know Adrian and Rochelle and Robin can also as well if you want to chat more. We have about a good 10 minutes before we close, and I wanted to bring up any other concerns you have regarding the project, regarding the scavenger hunt, regarding the class or the presentation. I want to hand that back to the class and ask a question. But actually, before we do that, can we give our guests a round of applause? I think they did a fantastic job of bringing us together. Yeah. It's great. It's always great to have my colleagues back sharing information. Yeah, I want to spend this time. I know it's close to the end, and this is our very, very last class. We break next week. We return back for presentation, and I'm here. I'm available. I'm not going anywhere because of COVID. So if you have questions between now and then regarding your presentation, please feel free to ask me and bring it up.
There was one question in the chat, Twee, if you don't mind, I'd like to answer.
No, go ahead. Go for it.
Someone asked those community meetings, all of the information from the community, what happened? I'm going to find the question so I can answer specifically what it was. Yeah, what happened to the record of those other community needs? Are they passed on by people or planners, or is it up to the community members to know where and with whom they need to bring up and those specific concerns? So I want to tell you that a lot of those community needs were used in order to create the, we called it the T2020 bond, but the Metro bill that didn't pass. Those community needs were what formed that measure. And so that was the measurement that Metro used in order to create, because the leading point at that engagement period, I told you it was over a span of years. They recognized, because of how long Division Transit was and how long the Vine was, these agencies started talking to each other. They started talking about how things go, because we meet in conferences and we talk to each other and how's it going and how's job and best practices and continuous improvement. And so that was put together as a package based entirely on the community engagement for most of those projects. But timing sometimes sucks. And that bill didn't pass. So there's a bunch of projects that would have built the things that people needed, the sidewalks, the streetlights, the things that we didn't. And I'm not saying that it was a great bill, because there was some serious flaws in how it was written, but that's the process. So now those people that put the time in over years to create that measure, they still have the information. They acted on it. And we have to help them figure out how to repackage it again. Now I already have a notice about what my community needs. I already thought through how much will it cost. I already thought through how could it be done at the planning level, but I didn't get that magic answer. So now we get to do it again. And it's why things like the very first Max line was built when I was 6, but the second Max line was built when I was 16, and then 17, and then 20, and then 22, until we got all of these, because it took a while to figure out how to make that work, how to get the funding in, how to make it grow and get that system. But first, people had to kind of think about how to do it. And we learned as well that one-stop shopping, like you need to be able to, as a community, to be able to go to a person and have your answers met or found or know who the right person is as a community. And one of the things that we're discovering is an industry is that people who work in the field know who to call, but people who don't know who to call. So we need to help our clients to create one-stop shopping resources. If I call you and say, I have a problem at this spot, you as a citizen don't necessarily, or me as a citizen, don't necessarily need to know who owns it to go talk to. It's kind of that conversation that I brought up when Peabot was here that one day that I happened to crash your class. If different agencies own different pieces of infrastructure, a citizen shouldn't need to go track down and find out, is it Metros, is it ODOTs, is it Peabots, does it belong to Multnomah County? How about Washington County? They should be able to call and say, there's a problem, let's try and solve it. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create, there's different compartments within these different agencies to start making those conversations more fluid. So if I go into a meeting about a project and a member of the community tells me about a problem, there is a person in that agency who will go talk to the other agency and make it happen and make that communication move. And that's what we're trying to do. And all of this is coming out of these equity conversations and this intentional going to the community thing. So staying engaged, and I mean, we've got more work to do on that as an industry, but that's the thing, is thinking about when you're voting, what is the ideas behind what you're voting on? Where did the thoughts come from? But also thinking about, before it becomes all the way to a vote, what communication should you have already had out there? What should have already been said or done or heard from someone? So I want to talk about that. Those conversations, they didn't disappear, but we had to define, how do we communicate that? How do we continue with that conversation when it's not transit work or not water work or not whatever?
And Twee, if I could grab a totally different question off the chat, one that I used to get all the time. Michael put one in here about autonomous vehicles, and if the whole presentation had been around autonomous, I think we would have talked a lot more about this. But he's talking about replacement of jobs, and any time that we take anything that was manual and make it autonomous, we're going to be displacing jobs with that. And so he's talking specifically about long haul truckers, but the same point can then apply to Uber and Lyft drivers and taxi drivers and eventually bus drivers. I mean, the automation of this industry will, in the long run, displace jobs. The good news for the truckers, and it is a good paying job right now for people without college education, the good news for them is that none of their jobs are really at risk in just the next few years. We have a shortage of tens of thousands of truckers, as the industry is right now, and the autonomy for years to come is going to allow a driver to drive much more safely for longer periods of time, but still have a job and still have to drive when they get into town and those kinds of things. And so that job, bus driver jobs, those I think are still got a couple decades in them before they're going to start to get displaced. Some of the Uber and Lyft is moving a lot faster. Again, we come back to the public and private discussion here. Uber and Lyft are highly incentivized to get rid of the driver. And so those are going to probably come a lot faster. The reality is, again, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. This is not something that we're going to stop from happening from a policy perspective to save jobs. But what we can't do is kind of what we did as a country with some of these other industries that got automated. We can't act like it catches us off guard and happens overnight and all of a sudden these jobs are gone. We've got some decades here ahead of us before those jobs start to go away. So let's start thinking about what the jobs of the future are going to be like, because every time we do autonomize or make things autonomous, it creates new jobs for the jobs that it replaces. So we have to be looking to the future and thinking about what a lot of those new jobs are going to be, and make sure that we're putting in the infrastructure within our schools and our systems to be training people and teaching people to be ready for those new jobs. But it is a very real concern, and it's not an issue just to pretend isn't happening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Taking that last question. So last year at this time, when I had Adrian in the class, we ended up going to the bar afterwards and carried on this conversation. There was like a really, really tight group. And unfortunately, because of we are where we are, I want to end the class with just a real sincere thanks to all of you for letting me lead this course again in the second year. It's always great to have a cohort of really interested folks who want to talk about transportation, who are not in the industry. And I think it's kind of it's a beauty and a blessing for me to see everybody come together. So I want to thank you again to our speakers. Thank you, Mulsri and Michael, for sticking in with us, and for all the speakers, and for the students to continue to carry on and be a part of the class. So I want to wish you a really, really, really safe holiday, and be well. I will see you on the 3rd for finals. So we'll be in communication between then. If you have any questions, please let me know. Tonight was great. Thank you.